quarter of $1,000,000.
Hello, I'm Michael Idato. I'm the TV critic for the Sydney Morning Herald.
And I'm Andrew Mercado. I'm a TV writer for the Sunday Telegraph and also wrote a book on the history of soaps called Super Aussie Soaps.
And we are watching episode 692 of Prisoner, the final episode, 692 hours of needless violence and chronic overwriting. And a lot of good fun.
And you know, in terms of finales, Michael, I think this is probably the greatest ever soap finale for an Australian soap. Because so many of the Aussie soaps sort of lose their way towards the end and sort of go out with a whimper rather than a bang. And first of all, what's that? It looks like a home unit inside the prison.
It does. In fact, the interesting thing about it is obviously this is at a time in the show where they had introduced a kind of a prisoner's privilege unit inside the prison. In actual fact, what it looks like is just two mismatched sets. It looks like Meg's living room, and someone's left a door open, and behind it on the soundstage at Nunawading there's a prison cell block corridor.
And Rita's there because she's got cancer. Is that why she had the luxury unit cell?
Correct. Mugshots: Kate Hood, Glenda Lynn Scott, Lois Collender. So we have here the fairly unlikely sort of plot of a corrupt officer assisting a prisoner to escape, all for the love of $100,000 out of a $250,000 robbery sort of prize. Not a lot of money, but perhaps what you might expect from Joan Ferguson.
And look, you really would have thought the freak would have said at least 50%.
Yeah, absolutely.
Come on, she would have at least gone 125.
This is a woman who made a career of sort of bundling $6 $1 bills and into her bra and considering it an adequate cut from the ill-gotten gains of all the prison misbehaviour. So the interesting thing about Joan is, for a corrupt officer, she always settled for a fairly small amount of cash, I thought.
Yeah.
There was never seemed to be a lot of money around, and it always seemed to be in fairly sort of badly rumpled up $1 bills.
But at the end of the day, you go with this because you want this show to wrap up with Joan getting her comeuppance.
Absolutely.
So you're prepared to go along with any ridiculous plot point in this last hour whatsoever. Oh, great to see a Monaro car on TV, isn't it? But you're prepared to go with it because it's really important that the show ends with her being put in the slammer. So I don't know, I thought about other soap endings, and of course, you know, in the Restless Years, you finally wrapped up the storyline in the last few minutes. Miss Mackenzie found out that Peter Beckett was her son. But, I mean, it didn't really count because neither of those characters were in the show when the Restless Years finished. They just brought them back to finish off that nice plot point. So it was good for long-term fans. And Sons and Daughters ended with, you know, Patricia getting back with David, even though she was Alison Carr. But again, David wasn't with the show. He just came back in the end. At least with this one, we found a way of closing it all with characters that are already established in the story. So in that respect, it's incredibly satisfying.
And I think probably a byproduct of the Australian production model. In the United States, I think the way programs are ordered and cancelled, very often you have enough notice perhaps to kind of to sign it off in an appropriate way. A lot of shows actually decide to retire themselves, as Seinfeld did, as a lot of shows did.
Yeah.
And in Australia, because these are serials essentially, and they're in continuous production, when the axe falls, it falls very abruptly.
Yes.
Now this is interesting. The ride alarm's being sounded. There's a couple of interesting things in this episode which I thought may well have been somebody sort of giving a silent nod to some of the hallmarks of the show. The ride alarm gets sounded.
Yeah.
There's a close-up of the fire hose in the garden later in the episode. There's just a few things where you sort of think, the dear old fire hose that stood there faithfully for 692 episodes gets a close-up in its final go.
I'm not quite sure how Rita got this ladder to work like this. Did she throw it up like with the bat?
I would imagine so.
The bat rope, and it just caught up on the pole at the top.
The other interesting thing here is there are a couple of holes, I think, in their plan, insofar as, you know, if the plan was to get the money, I would imagine, let her get out, let her steal the money, let her come back to the prison, and everyone's oblivious. But in fact, somehow or other, the plan is to sound the alarm because Rita's escaped, to notify everyone that she's escaped. And then to sort of, so you kind of sit there going, surely there was a better way to do this than drawing attention to the fact that the crime had been committed.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I need to admit, right up and down on this tape, that the latter years of Prisoner weren't high on my viewing schedule. I'm I tend to think that if you're a fan of Prisoner from the very, very early days and you were there with the original B. Smith and Lizzie and Doreen in those early days, the latter years somehow didn't quite have the same hold on you as much as the early years. And whereas, a lot of people I speak to who prefer these later years, often they were kids and teenagers who only started watching it towards the end of the years.
Yeah,
so they have this incredible respect for these characters here.
True. I think it's, that's absolutely fair. And I think that, there was clearly... There was a period. There was like a golden age, and sort of in the middle of Prisoner. Because I think now, when you look at the very early episodes, apart from some really strong episodes at the very beginning, it does very quickly. There are elements of it that are weak, and there are elements of it that are curiously dated. Even though the show itself it sort of has a timeless kind of quality because of its look. Some of them you do look at and go, gosh, this looks like early 70s, and really it's kind of late 70s. Whereas, in the middle of the show, and I would probably take a punt at somewhere in the vicinity of between 200 and 400.
Yeah.
There was an incredibly strong era of the show.
Very strong.
Probably because it was the period of time where the show had B. Smith, who was arguably its strongest character.
Correct.
And they gave her Joan Ferguson, who was really the only character.
The only real adversary.
Absolutely. And they
worthy adversary.
Absolutely. And they were kind of matched equally as these kind of two really diametrically opposed forces. One was a prisoner who was the good guy.
Yeah.
One was the prison officer who was the bad guy.
Yeah.
And it was the chemistry between those two characters, as written, and the two actresses was incredible. And so it is a fair cop, I guess.
Look, it was hard for me when B left the show, and then to lose Lizzie as well a few episodes later. Something really changed then for me. Now, Mikey, was this a show that your entire family watched when it first started?
Yeah, it was, absolutely. And I think it might be an unusual experience because when in hindsight I was sort of aged somewhere between sort of 8 and 14, and it's not necessarily perhaps my family were quite permissive. It's not the sort of show that you'd imagine all 8-year-olds were glued to. There is an interesting thing, I guess. At the heart of Prisoner, it's a playground story. And playground stories are universal. It has bullies and it has teachers and it has rules about dobbing and it has kind of a code of the schoolyard. And in that sense, I think school children, there is a lot of talk sort of in academia about Prisoner, about its appeal to young people. And at the heart of that is because they see a parallel to the schoolyard universe.
And I mean, how many schools in Australia were kids running around calling the female teachers they had vinegar tits?
Absolutely.
It was happening a lot, right?
Absolutely. But it was also, I think we sort of watched it with a sense of cartoonish disbelief. I remember in early episodes, the prison officer, the corrupt prison officer, Jock Stewart, puts Helen Smart and Judy Bryant to work as prostitutes. And in a very unlikely scene, clearly the production just parked those two poor actresses on a highway off-ramp somewhere in suburban Melbourne.
Wearing fur coats from memory.
In fur coats, sort of silky pants, clacky heels, cheap handbags, and way too much makeup. And when you're watching them on a highway with traffic hurtling past at 200 miles an hour, where clearly no one was going to stop and pick them up. And I remember my brother just watching in disbelief going, who's going to believe these two women as prostitutes? It was one of the most, it was cartoonishly unlikely.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Prisoner started in my last year of school. I was in grade 12, and amazingly too, it was something that went by in my household as well. Whereas years before, we'd had family arguments about whether or not I could watch Number 96. But of course, given that I was 16 by the time this started, I remember that my mother would watch it, but I remember my father did not like it at all. He started watching it and then he took a real dislike to it. Would get up and leave the room and go to the kitchen, put the old black and white portable and watch something else. Yeah, it never really got his imagination.
I remember also a really good friend of mine telling me a story about his mother in the scene, very early scene, and quite a provocative scene for the day, where Sharon Gilmore kisses Chrissy Latham on the neck, which was sort of in 1979 storytelling terms, a segue into a sort of a lesbian tryst. And he didn't really process what was going on screen, but what he processed was that as it was happening, his mother flew out of off the lounge, slammed her palm flat against the television in the old push-pull knob sort of TV era, and the TV went black, and she sent everyone to their rooms, and he didn't understand why. And then that weirdly, the memory and its association with that scene stuck with him for years.
No doubt she made it worse. Now here's, I think, a scene where you're saying a nod to great things in the show.
Absolutely. So now
the darkened corridor.
Absolutely. So we get a long shot of a cell block
with the kind of good night, Waltons.
Yes,
send off.
Absolutely. As I said, there's a few things in this episode where you think it's easy to imagine someone at the time probably thought it was important to acknowledge a couple of sort of the visual or kind of storyline hallmarks. I think the Right Alarm, which is kind of an old fan favourite, because Right episodes are kind of looked on with the same affection as kind of schoolyard brawls in a way.
Now, one of my theories as to why Prisoner has endured over the years is about a timelessness quality which could possibly exist in certain TV shows because of what they wear.
Yep.
And by that I mean, because we're in prison garb and officer uniforms, until they go out to the nightclubs at night, you don't really get a sense that it's set in the late 70s, early 80s.
Absolutely.
And so therefore, it can continue to play on television today and it doesn't look that dated.
Absolutely. You're right. I mean,
in the same way that Hogan's Heroes and a few other key shows like that.
Absolutely. In television terms, although obviously every television program is a genre, but the phrase genre show generally refers to Governor's Window. We'll come to that in a moment. A genre show is obviously like a science fiction show or a Western show, or a kind of prison show would be a genre show.
Yep.
Mainly, and they're called that because they're kind of departures from standard drama, but they all have a timeless quality.
Correct.
Science fiction has a sort of a timeless quality because nothing looks normal, nothing looks everyday. For the most part, everything looks kind of very, very clinical, very kind of automatic, very straight.
Now, what was going on? What is going on with the Governor's Window?
This is a really intriguing
Did Patsy King, did Erica Davidson ever have this window?
I think, yes, she did very late in her time as the governor. And the intriguing thing is, whenever you cut to the outside corridor, we are clearly quite deep in the cell block.
Yeah.
And yet, in actual fact, from wherever that corridor is, millimetres to the left of it, we're expected to believe the prison garden is in full bloom.
Yeah.
It is a bit of a struggle. And I'm surprised they sort of, no one at the time thought, is it a problem that when you go outside the governor's office, there is a corridor sharp left that would technically speaking, land you smack bang in the middle of the bushes?
Were you to make this show today, of course, there would be a door there to that garden, and that's where they go outside to smoke their cigarettes, because smoking would be banned indoors.
Yes, correct.
Today, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
You know.
Absolutely. This is Peter Curtin on screen as Detective Inspector Thorne.
Now, there's something... You were telling me that when this final episode screened in Sydney, and let's not forget that this show was always extra big in Melbourne, because people in Melbourne love shows that are made in Victoria and watch it and follow them through right to the end. So big event when the 2-hour episode of Prison came to an end in Melbourne. But in Sydney, it kind of screened quite late at night. What time do you think it screened?
The program itself normally aired at 8:30 for an hour, twice weekly. But this episode, and it's a byproduct of, obviously, the show was in its very last days, and it was not rating anymore. It was rating badly enough.
And it always had problems with its ratings in Sydney, didn't it?
Absolutely. And I think rating badly enough to justify cancellation is clearly a low rating. So in those situations, networks generally move very quickly to get shows out of prime time.
Yes.
This was aired as a 2-hour final episode, of which we are now watching the second hour of that. And it started at 10:30 at night and finished, because there is a review from the day in one of the newspapers where they make a note of the fact that it finished. It was a sad ending to kind of see it go, to see it wind up after midnight, essentially.
Because, you know what, there's so many times, this is going to sound very sad on my part, but there's so many times over the years that I've watched the last episode of a show, and quite often it's finished very late at night, and, you know, you go to bed with that awful feeling like, I can't believe one of my favourite shows has come to an end, and it's after midnight, and what an unglorious end for it all, and you go to bed quite sad that it's all finished. So, see, it's funny you should say it, because I remember when I grew up in Brisbane. In Brisbane, for a while there, at the height of its popularity, it was screening at 7:30. It, of course, started at 8:30, it was considered a little bit harder. And, you know, of course, some of the aspects of the violence and the lesbianism were a lot stronger, particularly in those family-friendly, almost sitcom, I guess. It used to screen at 7:30 p.m. on Channel O in Brisbane, which is really kind of family
Absolutely.
viewing
And
time.
that is interesting because this was adult themes, and there were a lot of episodes.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember the terrorist siege episodes were actually airing with an actual a dedicated warning. As in,
right.
the following episode of Prisoner contains scenes that some viewers may find disturbing.
Wow.
Because obviously there was gunfire, there were armed men, there was a lot of violence. I mean, it was very, very intense.
Yeah, yeah. When we talk about the fact that it's screened in America and, it was being screened all over the place on these funny sort of stations that were buying it in half-hour episodes, one of the biggest complaints over there was that we think of it as being a late-night show, but in fact, in many places they were screening it at 7:30 at night, and in Philadelphia they were screening it at 5 p.m. in the afternoon. And you can just imagine America in the early 80s, the most permissive commercial television in the world. Imagine if the parents walked into the kids before dinner to find them watching Prisoner at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It's quite outrageous in a way, isn't it? I wonder if they ever censored it over there. I've always wondered that. I've never heard they have, but I just can't imagine that they let it run. Americans of the day, that they weren't just up in arms about it. There were complaints about the early evening time slots for it when it's screened.
American classification is a peculiar thing, and there are a lot of things in America that they actually call unrated.
Yeah,
which
right.
kind of means, because it's sort of mandatory classification doesn't exist there in the way that it certainly didn't then in the way that it does in Australia.
Yeah.
So we have the plot unfolding here. Joan is mustering the courage to go and raid the cache.
Uncharacteristically sort of nervous and scared, isn't she?
I think also, and there's a line I think in this episode where she and she just said it, in fact, in the hospital scene with Rita, where Rita says to her, "Do you trust me?" And she says yes, or words to that effect. And when you watch it, you just go, "This really jars."
Yeah.
Joan Ferguson is not a woman who trusts prisoners. This is
Any
not
prisoner.
Absolutely, this is not the same woman who sees them as as scum and animals.
Now, maybe that hairstyle's a little bit early 80s.
Look, of course, and I think this is to talk about how it dates. It is interesting. The minute you do leave the prison, you're absolutely dating the show.
Particularly when they would go to one of those dingy wine bars to
Terrible,
those offices.
terrible wine
They're always
bars.
there to pick up.
Absolutely. And Meg's apartment, which I think at different times was possibly the worst furnished apartment in Australia. I mean, it was pretty dire stuff.
Yeah. I noticed when we were writing up storylines for the book here, there was a storyline where Meg decided to leave her unit, and it's sort of like, well, yeah, I mean, she got raped in that unit, her boyfriend got his kneecap shot off in that unit.
Why would you want to stay? Yeah. Is the big question. We've got John McTernan on screen here playing Tom Lucas.
Who used to be in Cop Shop.
Correct, yep.
And was also number 96 in its dying days. I'm sure if you speak to any actor that joins a show in its dying days, they find it a very disturbing experience. A new actor coming into an established show when the writing is on the wall.
And I think also the momentum is running dry. People are, it's that Titanic mentality. It's like, boarding the Titanic once the iceberg's hit. You think it's all new, but everyone around you is basically packing a bag and looking for a lifeboat. And you're sort of going, well, is anyone playing shuffleboard? No one's playing shuffleboard.
The actresses would hang out. Let's talk a little bit about the behind-the-scenes stuff, because I know a lot of the actresses who've done commentary episodes on this box set they're quite nice. They don't speak badly of each other. And we're not going to name names here, but we can maybe talk about some of the stuff that went on behind the scenes, because the green room for these actors, where they would hang out, was kind of underground at these Channel 10 studios. And they used to call it the tunnel, which is where they would hang out between rehearsals and between takes. In fact, Rowena Wallace came up with another nickname for it. She called it the vivisection tunnel, because she said she had never heard people ripped apart so badly in her entire life as she did when she was on that show. I think
the show, it was a very bunker-like. I mean, it's still there. If you go to the Nunawading studio, the tunnel still exists, and it's a very bunker-like place. It's airless, it's windowless, and you can see how any group of people, but particularly a group of people of one gender, either a group of boys or a group of girls.
Yeah.
Obviously, when genders are separated, behaviour patterns get a little bit wacky. And obviously, there was this group of women there from very early in the morning. They obviously left their homes in darkness, returned to their homes in darkness, spent all days in a windowless, airless, lightless, artificial sort of environment. And obviously, over a period of time, it absolutely doesn't surprise you that you do, all those personality quirks come out, and there's a lot of kind of personality energy in a really
and
compact
let's
space.
not forget that we've got women playing tough prisoners.
Absolutely.
And some of them are doing it now at this stage for years on end. And you speak to any sort of TV director, they all say there's this kind of one director I spoke to who actually directed this show. He had a time period of 6 months on it. He said that after 6 months the actor would quite often turn into the character. And I mean, that means you've got a lot of kind of tough women, and they're kind of in prison, aren't they? They're downstairs, and it must have been a scary place, especially for new actors coming into that.
Absolutely.
No, not really.
What do you mean?
Well, I went there, and there was a lot of activity.
Now, the plot's really sort of cooking up now, isn't it?
You chicken. I was being cautious.
Bull! What do I have to do?
I think for a time when perhaps when the show wasn't being written with the sort of strength that it had at different times in its life, I think in some ways this last episode is a bit of an anomaly, because the writing does suddenly, there is a sharpness and a tautness, and there's some great personal kind of energy going on here. Glenda Lynn Scott is a great actress.
She's fantastic.
And Maggie is fantastic in almost every way as Joan Ferguson. She's one of those extraordinary kind of characterizations that is just breathtaking to watch. I mean, she understands every nuance of this woman, and she plays her with such truth and such clarity that she sort of, I often think in television, the challenge is not really to do something believably, but I kind of look at it the other way and sort of go, the challenge is not to look ludicrous in that situation. It's not about looking brilliant. It's actually just not about looking ridiculous or out of place.
Well, making
or
it
wrong.
real, I suppose.
Absolutely,
isn't it?
yeah. And there's a natural truth to Maggie's delivery that just makes you go, I don't doubt for a moment. I mean, she's an impressive woman to meet, but in some ways fearsome, particularly if you've watched the show, because when you meet her, she's so
she's tall and imposing,
she's so
isn't she?
unlike Joan Ferguson. She's actually such a well-spoken.
But she's got that physical stature.
Absolutely.
You could just, if she, walked into a room to see you and walked in like Joan Ferguson, a chill would go up your spine.
Absolutely. I mean, she has an incredible presence, but it's there's this incredible energy in the performance.
And Maggie is on record in my book that, she was one of the people that really kind of didn't agree with a lot of stuff that went on in the tunnel from the actors, and, tells a story of how she and one of the actresses, I think it was Carol Skinner, actually bought a farewell present for an actor who'd been there in a guest role, who they thought had been treated very, very badly. And so they made a particular point of sending her off and making her feel good about herself.
There's the fire hoses close up.
Yeah. Now, this set is still there today. It's basically the backside of Neighbours now, isn't it?
Yes, it's the exterior of the Nunawading site, which was the old Channel 10 studio in Melbourne, now Global Television Studios. And the peculiar aspect of it obviously is that back in this time there was not a lot around it. Now it's the heart of suburbia.
Yeah.
If you look at the building on the right angle, there are still cell block windows hanging on it. So it is one of those. It is an architectural peculiarity that, and even going there for different reasons. When you take people out the back of Nunawading and sort of show them the cell block, they often find it quite jarring, because in some ways, if you know the show, it's such an iconic structure.
Look, in the day, in the early 80s, 1980, I actually made the pilgrimage and drove out to Nunawading and looked at the outside of the prison cell and went, oh my God, there it is. And literally just the other day, I was at Neighbours, and I walked out the door, and there was this kind of demountable, and we stood on the grassy knoll just there in the background.
Yep.
And as I glanced back, I saw the red brick. I thought, oh my God, there it
still,
is.
It absolutely still
It's got a demountable in front of it, so it's a bit confusing.
And
but
there's
it's
actually a
still
lot
there.
out there. Now, we are now on the other side of Nunawading, so we've actually they're shooting this scene on completely around the other side of the building. The most interesting aspect, I think, of this scene is that as the camera, in a few moments, you'll start to see the camera cycle around Meg and Anne. Meg, of course, sporting one of the great perms of the 1980s. And the thing that will really strike you is, for a prison that would, I don't know, I mean, it never seemed to have more than 9 prisoners and about sort of 3.5 staff. There are about 650 cars in the car park. Yeah. It is actually one of the most jarring visuals. As you can start to see now, the first cars, there's a combi up the end. You were seeing about sort of a dozen cars now.
And this is so unusual that in the final episode, they suddenly find something to do that they could have been doing throughout the entire series.
Absolutely. Now we're seeing the building again, and back around couple more 100 cars. I mean, who are all those people? Yeah. Is it visiting day at Wentworth? I mean, and if it's visiting day, why isn't Meg in reception trying to cope with the hundreds of people who are clearly trying to get into the prison?
Now, I would like to give a big kick out to whoever did that shot. That was
Absolutely.
A great little shot.
It was
there.
a great shot.
The editing in this episode also is quite fantastic. It's like they took some extra time to edit this and get the music just right. Particularly, we'll see that in one of the closing scenes. Quite spectacularly done for a final episode of the show, where a lot of the time the crew are just going, the last person out the door, switch off the lights. They really gave this. And, I often think too that when you end a series on a high note like this is what makes it so much more likely to be repeated.
Absolutely.
Because it goes out on such a high, people say, now I want to watch the whole thing again, because they know that if they stick with it, they get to an amazing end.
And interestingly, I think with shows, if it does crash and burn and it ends with an unresolved cliffhanger, it struggles in a way. It struggles to keep its place in your heart because your experience is angry. 2 great examples from the 1980s: Dynasty or Dynasty and Dallas.
Yep.
Dynasty ended on an unresolved cliffhanger. It had an awful sort of sequel kind of pickup miniseries. It was botched spectacularly at the very end. And it has really struggled to survive, particularly on DVD. The first season box set sold very sluggishly. Dallas, on the other hand, built itself up to a spectacular finale, wrote this amazing final episode, had Joel Grey playing the devil. I mean, there was a beautiful twist to it all. And as a result, your association with the show, your memories of the show are so potent that you actually want to keep the friendship even after it's gone. So you re-embrace it.
And I guess the great 2 modern, I guess, unresolved cliffhangers we should talk about is Footballers' Wives, ended on a cliffhanger, and you just want to see Tanya Turner have a beautiful final scene in that. I can't believe they've ended it that way. And then The Sopranos, which has ended on a very ambiguous setting. It'll be interesting to see what history thinks of The Sopranos in a few years' time, given that it kind of sputters out to this ending and leaves it in your own mind to decide. I think viewers actually like to... They want to see an ending.
Absolutely.
And Prisoner delivers in this respect.
Yes, so have I. She'll be ripping us off left, right and centre. Gee, you will not. You won't, will you, Cat?
So this is the tense, I guess, the sort of the pensive scene. The top dog is stepping down and she's appointing her successor, a woman who's largely been a villainess. That's Philip Hyde as one of the young trainee officers.
I must admit, I'm glad to see that Rita doesn't look terribly well here, because to sort of go from her sitting in the lounge chair getting chemotherapy to climbing up a rope ladder and pulling off a high, so it's kind of like,
there is a bit of a leap
where
there.
did she get the energy to that? And then, of course, as I kept watching, I remember, she did faint. And exactly you would. If you're in the middle of treatment for cancer, you would be a little bit exhausted after that.
I would imagine maybe you'd be a bit exhausted after scaling a cyclone fence on the run from the cops with a bag of loot strapped to your back as well.
Now, this guy's sort of a leftover here, because in the last few months of the show, they brought in this Blackmore prison, which was called The Hole, the worst prison of all. And Rita was transferred there. She started to write. She burnt it down. So then the prisoners from there got moved into Wentworth. And, of course, it was another excuse to bring some men into the prison.
Yep.
And this guy's a leftover from that, isn't he?
He is, yeah, it is. It's Mike Bishop playing Harry, who is a love interest for Alice Jenkins.
Because
aka
God knows
Lurch.
Lurch was the one that would have a love interest,
of
right? Have a
course.
look at her.
Yes. Yeah, so it's obviously he's been sort of shanghaied off to Barnhurst and is hoping to send Lurch there with him. Barnhurst, of course, being the prison where very famously men and women, it's a prison farm where men and women were together because Chrissy Latham was sort of, I seem to remember, constantly in a state of pregnancy as a result of a stint at Barnhurst. The most unconvincing use of a telephone in a TV drama.
Now, Gerda Nicholson as the governor here.
Yep.
In actual fact, we can criticise Prisoner where they repeated characters and got it wrong. You know, they tried to do Lizzie again, it never worked. They tried to do Doreen again, it never worked. But replacing Erica Davidson with Anne Reynolds, I thought was really great.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Gerda Nicholson, who up to this point was best known for Bellbird,
Yep.
I thought did a magnificent job.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have the prisoner theme.
And there's
playing.
that rose.
There's the last rose on the rose bush.
Yeah.
In the unlikely scenario of two prisoners left alone in the governor's office.
Making a big noise now! You should have done it when Connors called for the...
So we are in the recreation room. It's just another miserable, complaining day.
Exactly as Rita set it up.
Why?
Because I happen to agree with it.
God, you change your...
Now, Kate Hood's Kath has gone from sort of essentially the block's resident baddie. She's now the top dog. So her previous everyone take heroin policy has been replaced with a no drugs policy. Which,
Well, of course,
you know,
in Wentworth, I guess one of the most unbelievable plot points of prison was that, you know, you would actually have a top dog that would be anti-drugs. Because, of course, in the day, prisoners, everyone said prisoners were awash with drugs. But, of course, given that this show was being screened in an early time slot, and particularly when it became popular with kids, it was very important. It's TV. The show had to remain anti-drugs. And it always made an interesting plot point that your top dog was so against it. And I guess we're just inducting this final prisoner here as
We are.
another final
I
nod
think so, yeah, to one of the hallmarks of the show. This is Helen Stevens, who's from Barnhurst.
And she comes from Barnhurst, and I think, oh, she's going to tell us some fabulous little
Absolutely.
thing about Vera Bennett at
Absolutely.
Barnhurst or B. Smith's grave there, who
Absolutely.
died in a
Yep.
fire, and then nothing.
This is the most unconvincing prison officer in the prison service, Rodney Adams. Interestingly, with this episode, there is this girl has come from Barnhurst. There is another obscure reference later on when we won't talk about exactly what happens in case you were one of the 2.5 people left on the planet that haven't seen the last episode already. But there is an interesting reference to the potential sequel or spin-off to Prisoner, because at the time, obviously, there was a proposal for a spin-off which would have been set at Barnhurst, and there is a very interesting line which I'll bring up at the time, which threads very neatly into that, and when you read it, it's so incongruous in the scene, it sort of almost makes no sense, but when it's said, if you think of it in the context of the potential sequel to Prisoner, there was clearly one story thread being set up here.
I wonder, have we ever asked Fiona Spence if the Barnhurst sequel had got off the ground? Would she have returned as Governor Vera Bennett?
Absolutely.
One would have
Who knows?
assumed you wouldn't have done it if you couldn't have got her there. Long-term Prisoner fans would have gone, hang on, that's not Vera. And given that Fiona Spence did Home and Away after this, she probably could have been talked into another. Certainly to have been in the beginning of it. If she didn't want to do long running, I'm sure you could have killed off a governor quite spectacularly in a riot or something.
Mm-hmm. There's obviously always a struggle in a final episode, I think, to sign off all the right notes.
Yeah.
And I think the balance in this episode is actually really good. I think they've taken the time to kind of nod to all the series hallmarks.
Yep.
They're kind of, this Lois is struggling with basically her sort of sense of duty to the gang, and the fact that the bloke she loves is leaving.
Yeah.
Interestingly, Lois got the on the inside theme in her Rose scene, but in a strange way, it was probably would have been more appropriate here.
Yeah.
Because it's being given to the dying top dog of the block.
And you know, a classic final episode should tug at the heartstrings a little bit.
Absolutely.
And certainly the spectre of Rita dying and everyone sort of realising she could be on her way out. I mean, that scene where she's on the Harley Davidson motorbike, that's a great scene.
Absolutely.
You know,
See you later.
it's sad, but it's uplifting at the same time, which is great TV.
Today has been one of the...
Of course, one of the reasons they've kind of explained that Joan Ferguson has struck this, what has become this sudden and rather unlikely alliance with Rita, is that Joan has been impressed with the way that she has handled her cancer and been amazed at her strength through it. And so, you know, as this dynamic has changed between them over the years, suddenly Joan has developed a slight bit of respect for Rita and the way she's handling her treatment. And she doesn't look well there, does she?
So a nice long shot of the driveway into Nunawading. Joan, of course, is a reader of the Melbourne Age newspaper.
Do you think...
Some missing bricks there on the...
Yeah. Now, I mean, global studios, I mean, one of these days, they're going to have one hell of a last, you know, bring in prisoner fans all over the world to say goodbye to this, because the suburbs are sort of encroaching behind there now. They've sold off a few parcels of land.
Absolutely. And I think it's not even a question now.
It's going to go one day,
Absolutely.
isn't it?
Well, I think it's going to go in the next couple of years.
They've already filled in that swimming pool that they used for Holiday Island, which became the lake at Lassiter's.
That's right.
It became a bit of a guppy pond the last time I
think
was
also
there.
Global Television, which owns the site now, is moving into the heart of Melbourne with a different studio facility. This now, once in the middle of nowhere, is the heart of suburbia. The land on which it sits is worth an absolute mint.
Yeah.
So there is and it's happening with television production companies all over the world and networks that are sitting on prime geography, moving to much smaller offices because broadcast operations have changed, technology has changed, and it's kind of, I guess it's a logic of real estate.
Do you think we could start the petition now to make this prison, the back of this prison wall, some sort of,
Heritage
National
listed.
Trust building?
Yeah, we could.
If you kept this building, you could build houses around it. You could turn that into some fabulous warehouse apartments, couldn't you?
We could. We just had a fabulous close-up of the gruel served in the dining room. Another, I think, one of the curious...
They had a lot of porridge, didn't they?
They did one of the curious nods. I think a lot of mashed potato.
A lot of mince.
A lot of mince and a lot of mash with buttered white bread. I mean, it was truly...
And it looks like tang on the... Milk and tang orange juice. They're a motley looking group.
They
aren't
were.
they?
I think actually there are actually government regulations about what you have minimum nutritional requirements in the prison service that were never observed by the show. I think we can safely say that was a bit of shocking inaccuracy.
And we do know from talking to a lot of the actors who did this, the food scenes were all done on one particular day.
Correct.
So they would spend all day filming in this dining room, and of course, let's face it, if you're sitting there and an actor and you're going through, you'd be eating a lot of potato, mince and porridge, wouldn't you?
And white bread.
Yeah.
Yep. So like a massive carbs overload on a scale. I think this is an interesting scene. Obviously they're grieving, and in the middle of their grief a bell rings and their grief is interrupted by the routine of folding, washing, and it's sort of obviously an illustration of kind of the way in prison and in Prisoner that kind of the natural functions of a human being are kind of interrupted by the prison's routine, which takes precedence in every situation.
That's right. Got to get on with it.
They're grieving the loss of a great mate, and they've got to keep on trying, don't they? As Alice said, perhaps a tad unconvincingly in that scene.
And how did it get like that?
It got like that because you took it in both hands and tore it. And that's exactly what I'll tell Mrs. Reynolds.
So will I.
Me too. We all will.
I'm surprised you tried that, Ferguson.
And so finally, in episode 692, the women discover that all it takes to topple Joan Ferguson is to gang up on her and promise to all tell the same story.
Yes. She tore that pillow slip. I saw her.
Yep, absolutely.
I saw her.
7 witnesses, murderers, whores, thieves and killers among them. And Joan's been defeated.
But look at that cat's got the respect of the women.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, I suppose, obviously, that there's nothing particularly unusual about that scene in the context of the history of Prisoner. That was, except that in the history of Prisoner, Joan would never have capitulated.
No.
Obviously, though, that scene in this episode is needed to basically assure us that life will get better for these women, that they have somehow found a new kind of resolve to look after one another, and that they will survive. There's an earlier scene outside the prison with Meg and Anne where we discover that Anne's reforms have been pushed through. So we are in the staff room.
I believe it happened at 2 o'clock.
Yes.
And we are very firmly of the belief at this stage that Rita Connors has died. And that
Well, no one deserves to go like that, especially not in a place like this.
and that Joan Ferguson is inexplicably showing the first signs of humanity in almost 300 episodes.
I'm glad that Meg got to have a little bit of a laugh in the garden with Anne before, because poor old Meg, Saint Meg as they used to call her.
Tough old time.
Oh, she had a horrendous time during this show, didn't she? And she's such a funny lady, Elspeth Ballantyne, and so sort of unlike that character. She loves to laugh, and she said that she was a terrible giggler. Her and Fiona Spence would set each other off, and the more the producers would say, "You're costing us thousands of dollars," the more they would laugh. She's environmentally conscious even back then, Joan. She had a green recycle bag. She was ahead of her time.
She was. Unlike this woman who was wearing was a walking, talking testament to the late 1980s and the needless use of artificial fibres.
Look at that shoulder pad. You can actually see it just poking through there.
And a very early computer on the table, a fairly ordinary partition that sort of makes me want to think this was actually shot in the near the production office at Nunawading. But I don't think it was. Although that armchair looks familiar.
Actually, I think it could have been at Grundy House, actually.
Okay.
Handy that this mop and bucket's here, isn't it?
It is.
To pop the door open.
The oldest trick in the book, the mop on the door handle. Not very convincingly, but it'll do for the scene. And I think we just saw the head of the sound guy on the wall in a shadow. Couldn't be sure about that.
And I don't know about standing on a wicker chair either, Joan.
No,
Although,
she did take her shoes off.
yeah, she did. It looks like it gets caught here. It's like, it's going to get caught, and
I think there's a production assistant hanging on to it. And in fact, I don't think that was a roof. That was clearly just a wall that was dangling over the other side. Into the recycle bag. Silly old Joan. I think there's this first law of life and television drama is always remain true to yourself.
Yep.
She's trusted a prisoner.
Yes.
Mistake number
Big
one.
mistake.
Her last
However,
mistake.
she has her house has been burnt down and she didn't have insurance.
Yep.
If
There's natural
we've watched
justice.
we've watched
There's
the
natural
previous
justice.
episodes to this. She is at her wit's end. She's maybe a couple more lines about maybe she wasn't going to get a pension or something that would have caused her to do this.
Yep.
Thank you, but I can manage.
And so it begins. This music is called Icescape. It's a piece of stock music from a fairly big family of stock music that the show used with some regularity.
You're under arrest.
How could you be so stupid?
It's
Great
very
scene.
reminiscent of the Halloween theme, isn't it? Just a couple of notes.
Absolutely.
Ding, 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 ding.
Now this is...
Okay, so from this point on now, it's all gold.
Yep. Now we just have Ian Smith just there, playing the police officer. Ian Smith, of course, played Ted Douglas and became the story editor of the show in a cameo in the final episode, sort of as a sort of sign-off, I think. Obviously, his association with the show was very long. Joan being fingerprinted. Obviously, the music's played. It's not a montage, but it's kind of directed as a montage.
Yes.
Because this is meant to, we're sort of obviously travelling through the build-up to the great reveal, which is where she'll be sent once she's charged.
Do they actually point? They never make it clear where they're sending her.
They do. They say to Western Australia.
But I
Yep,
thought they
and,
said not Western Australia because there was some.
Said, the line is, I think,
The
she's
West.
being,
they say the West, don't
to
they?
the West. of course, this is dramatically ludicrous. Under no circumstances would someone who had worked as a prison officer be sent back to that prison as a prisoner. But of course, for dramatic purposes, this is the great denouement.
We must go there.
This is the great final reveal that she's returned to the indignity of
Oh, this is gold.
Really enjoying this, aren't you?
Stand on the line.
All right. Do it, Morris. Come on, I'm here. Do it.
Your name?
Ferguson. Joan Ferguson. What comes next, Morris? Hey, what comes next? You must think all your birthdays have come at once. You must really be enjoying... Sorry.
Your name is Joan Ferguson, is that correct?
Yes.
You've been charged with assisting in an indecent
If it was any other episode apart from the final episode, I would have put this in as a Logie moment for Best
absolutely.
Actress. She
Absolutely.
is superb in this.
This is a great scene.
This final ep.
This is a great scene.
Yes.
It's all over for Joan Ferguson.
I want your people to
Now,
be
interesting
as soon as
line
possible.
coming up here.
10 o'clock, I can't do it any earlier.
All right, but I can't guarantee her safety.
Well, nobody can, that's why she's been sent to the west. Apparently they've got a similar problem over there.
Apparently they've
See,
got a similar problem
over there.
So the suggestion is if we had gone to Barnhurst,
Yeah.
one of the prisoners may well have been a former screw.
Yeah, that's the
who
part
was
that, that
transferred in.
confuses me.
Absolutely.
What problem could they have had in the West?
Well, a similar problem. So they have a prison officer who can't be jailed in the
Ah.
West and has to be sent east.
Okay, so if you're watching this at 20 past 12 in Sydney back in 1986 or 87,
86.
you'd be getting very sad now. You'd be looking at that clock knowing this is it.
Absolutely.
There are 2 security gates between you and the women. There's only one to isolation. It's for your own protection.
Oh, see? Everyone's concerned.
Lighting's
about
not too
my
crash hot here, is it?
The lighting isn't too crash hot. The lighting was always a bit peculiar in prison. There was an artistic attempt to kind of, I think, sort of
Dark
create
shade.
to create some texture in the corridors.
I suppose, yeah.
There were always some stray lights that made you wonder where the light source was or what was blocking it. So she has showered in accordance with the regulations. This is Michael Winchester as Marty Jackson.
The third actor
The third
to play
actor
Meg's
to
son.
play, yep. Andrew McCaig before him and a young boy in the first block of episodes.
The gate's locked.
5.
Eh?
That's the 5th time you've asked the same question.
Security gate in the library corridor's locked too. Yeah, the one at the loading bay. Now, what's going on, Mr. Jackson?
It's always been a bit of a fallacy that the set, the set shook in Prisoner. That's
Absolutely.
a real UK thing.
True.
I mean, this was solid brick walls and solid bars. Perhaps Meg's home unit may have had a little bit of a shudder to it
That's true.
when she slammed the
That's
door
true.
there, but the prison cells
It actually
did not
was.
shake, did
Yeah,
they?
No, I think the only time I think that sort of comes again from that very early block of episodes, which are kind of dated episodes, and it generally only happens in scenes where a door is slammed and the
Yeah.
wall doesn't handle the slam too convincingly.
In The Young Doctors, the set shook.
yes, no
But in
question.
Prisoner, they didn't.
I didn't tell her. I just picked her up from sick bay. She must have found out there.
True. It's true. She's in the pound.
Ferguson!
Now this is again probably one of the 3 great scenes in this episode, and one we were discussing earlier one of the possible moments where you could have faded to black.
Oh, there's the
Yeah,
kitchen. There's that last
absolutely.
shot of the kitchen.
We now get a flickering sort of montage of all the major locations. Governor's office,
Fabulous.
staff room, reception.
Did you not hear me? I said shut up! How did you know?
Back against the wall.
Tell me how you knew. They were waiting for me. How?
Ferguson, there'll be no discussion until you do as you're told. Now stand against the wall.
Oh, earning our money, are we, Reynolds? Justifying our existence in this place, eh? Well, you can forget it, Reynolds. You are an amateur. Always have been and you always will be. I ran this place. Me. It's me they hate. Ferguson. Because Ferguson stuck to the rules. Ferguson kept them in line. Ferguson was always one step ahead of them. Ferguson! Ferguson! Ferguson!
This is Maggie Kirkpatrick in fine form.
Fabulous.
Interesting, there's a line from much earlier in the series that Meg Morris says, the only difference between an officer and a prisoner is a conviction. And I think that perfectly illustrates it. Here is a woman who has all the emotional intensity and capability of a thug, and up until now has, been on the side of the law because of the uniform.
She's going to make a great top dog. Wherever Joan Ferguson ends up, she's going to be top dog.
No question.
Of course, the suggestion here is that Meg and Anne are all part of this plot, aren't
Absolutely.
they?
The implication
Which again
here
is ludicrous. The governor of
not just the governor, but the governor, the
and
deputy
Meg
governor,
too.
and the police.
I mean,
the police
I know Meg
force.
hated Joan, but come on, the police are in on it. Yeah.
So clearly, the conspiracy was to dupe Joan into believing that Rita had died.
Yeah.
Thinking she had a safe run for the money.
Of course, Rita could have always told them about this ruse afterwards and said, "Look, she's in on it."
No question. I would say that there's at some point, clearly at some point there is there's been a switch where the police have gone from investigating the crime to being part of the.
Now, what's fabulous about this is, of course, some of these extras that have been there from the very first episode, quietly milling around in the background, saying nothing. Get a close-up in this last moment. Now, it's hard to know what they all know, their names were, but I do know that two of them were called Barbara Jungworth and Hazel Henley.
Barbara Jungworth played Lorna, who is about to get her close-up. There she goes. That was Lorna in an instant. Lorna, who was interestingly there in episode 1, in the from the absolute first frame of the show.
And the only speaking actor to be there from the beginning to the end was Elspeth Valentine as Meg.
Mm-hmm. Sort of a curious sort of final indignity for Joan. Again, dramatically unlikely, but I suppose we write it out because this is kind of the great comeuppance that the audience and the characters.
And you know what? You almost sort of feel sorry for Joan several times during this episode, which is great acting, great writing. But the fact remains that if you look back over the history of the show, she deserves it all.
She does, no question.
She was a rotten bitch from the beginning to the end. But you feel sort of sorry for her in the last episode.
You sure?
But television is bizarre, isn't it? The way they can...
It is.
Clever writing, clever directing and good performances can bring that out.
The officers leave, the prisoners cheer. And an era, in a lot of ways, for Australian television closes. This is probably one of the great television icons of the 20th century in Australia.
And the cameraman goes up to the roof of Channel 10 where Leanne Burke fell off.
She did.
All those years ago.
Many protests were held up there.
And they do one last aerial shot. Okay, very quickly, your favourite prisoner moment ever?
I would have to say episode 326, the great showdown between Joan and B. The battle just this battle between these two Titanic characters,
the fire
two Titanic
cliffhanger.
women. Absolutely, huge drama, great moment.
Look, my favourite moment is when Lizzie goes to visit her brother in hospital and he's dying, and she loses it and goes, "You rotten old bastard! I hope you rot in hell." It's Sheila Florence at her finest.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, there it is, the greatest ever finale for one of the greatest ever Australian TV shows. Great ending.
Prisoner.
And I hope everyone's loving seeing it all on DVD. Officially now the biggest box set in the world as of this moment when we're recording this.
Absolutely. This is the final strut through the credits. That staircase still exists at Nunawading.
The next time I go to Nunawading, I am finding this staircase. I walk around Neighbours and I forget to say, where's the prisoner's staircase? Take me downstairs to the vivisection tunnel.
Interestingly too, this is an iconic title sequence. Everybody knows this song. Everybody associates it with Prisoner. This is kind of, it's a sweet, sad send-off.
I'm Andrew Mercado, thank you.
I'm Michael Idato. I hope you enjoy all 692 hours.
It's a lot of TV.